Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this webinar presentation. We are Defense Systems Information Analysis Center, or DSIAC, one of 3 IAC domains in the DoD Information Analysis Centers operating under the Defense Technical Information Center, DTIC, within the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Our informative webinar series highlights current and emerging research and technology developments. It presents an opportunity for accelerating the DoD's leverage of these advancements by increasing awareness and fostering technical collaboration. DSIAC serves as one of the premier information research partners and curators of technology advancements and trends for the defense systems community. As such, our organization supports those working in the defense systems domain of DoD research and engineering. We do so by helping navigate the vast landscape of scientific and technical information, allowing our customers to get a head start on their technical projects. With an understanding of the defense system's DoD research and engineering landscape, we provide research and analysis services. We help unlock access to information, knowledge, and best practices from government, industry, and academia to stimulate innovation, foster collaboration, and eliminate redundancy. We hope you enjoy this webinar presentation and that it serves as a catalyst for community collaboration and improved DoD defense systems research.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody who has joined in. Appreciate everyone taking the time to participate in this webinar. Hopefully that little commercial came in loud and clear. Right now my name is Brian Benich with DSIAC, the technical lead for the Defense Systems Information Analysis Center, and I'm happy to have Melinda here to deliver this webinar presentation on electromagnetic spectrum operations. Before we go ahead and hand it over to her, just wanted to give a quick overview for everybody about the platform that you're in and the logistics of the webinar. So Melinda's going to deliver the webinar presentation in a few moments, and at any time during the presentation, if you have a question for her, I would direct you to the Q&A section that you should see inside the WebEx platform. I want to distinguish that from the chat section of the platform. The chat will go to the presenters, but really the Q&A section is where we want you to put your questions. At the end of the presentation, we'll go to those questions and deliver them to Melinda one at a time in the order that they are received. So if you have any questions, please put them in there. If you have any technical difficulties or challenges during the presentation, you can reach out to us at our contact @dsiac.org, and somebody will help troubleshoot with you as quickly as possible. But if all else fails, rest assured that this webinar presentation is being recorded and will be available for you to check out at a later date. And then last bit, if you do have any other technical difficulties, perhaps maybe only hearing audio and not being able to get the video, the visuals, the slides are available on the webinar's webpage on DSIAC website. So you can navigate to dsiac.org, find this webinar's webpage, and you can get the slides directly from there and follow along with the audio if you have that. So that covers the basis for logistics. And without further ado, I will hand the mic over to Melinda. So Melinda, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. This is Melinda Taranjo. We're going to take 10 seconds to make sure that everyone can read me okay. How do you read me? Put it in the chat if you can't hear me or the volume needs to go up. Brian, do we have any messages from our audience?
Nothing yet, but all coming in loud and clear for me.
Very good. All right, then we're going to press on. I'm going to put the screen in full mode. Can everyone see that? I'll take another second to make sure the visual is good, Brian.
You're getting good feedback.
Excellent. Okay. Hello, everyone. Once again, my name is Melinda Taranjo. It rhymes with banjo, and you will get an opportunity to be quizzed at the end to pronounce my name. But it's very nice to be here with all of you today to do this webinar for DTIC DODIAC. And today's topic is electromagnetic spectrum operations, or EMSO, what you need to know. And the bottom line up front is electronic warfare has evolved way beyond the original mission space. It isn't what it used to be. And therefore, we need a culture change, a really important culture change. And so we're looking for an opportunity to understand language and evolve beyond how we used to think about electronic warfare, conduct electronic warfare, and plan for electronic warfare. And this will get us ready for the 21st century and way beyond if we need it. So I look forward to sharing with you today my thoughts on that. A little introduction. The RVJ Institute is a 501c3 not-for-profit research institute dedicated exclusively to electromagnetic spectrum operations excellence for the Department of Defense and eventually for electromagnetic spectrum excellence for the world. And after I get through this presentation, you will see why our mission is two-pronged like that and why we had to begin with the DoD and why eventually we expect to be serving the world. So before I jump into a formal part of my presentation, I want to share a few things with you. Everything now is connected. Whatever once was, we are now wholly a systems of systems world. And what is enabling this paradigm shift is extraordinary advances in technology being enabled by big data analytics using artificial intelligence and machine learning. And what that means is electronic warfare must also evolve with these incredible changes. And with everything else, with the DoD and how it used to execute electronic warfare during the Cold War, and especially during Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan and Iraq, we can no longer continue to define electronic warfare the way we did and use it the way we did. And I don't know how many people are on the phone, Brian. I heard over 250 registrants today. I don't know anything about the audience, but I'm going to assume that most of you know what the EW space is and that you know it has needed to change. How can we change it? Well, now we have incredible computational tools and processing power to manage this new system of systems. Everything is now connected. And most importantly, for the Joint PUV 385, we need to be dealing with dynamic spectrum access and spectrum sharing solutions that go way beyond what EW had devised 60 years ago or even 80 years ago. So let's get to today's agenda. First, we'll be talking about the electromagnetic environment as a lexicon. And if you don't know what a lexicon is, yes, I will be defining it. And then what is the electromagnetic environment? What has changed? We're going to talk about that and possibly in a way you've never seen before. I'm going to go into an explanation of the electromagnetic spectrum and electromagnetic spectrum operations. And then just recently, I had a little conversation on LinkedIn with several people about the nexus of cyberspace and MSO. So I thought that was worth bringing up. And then finally, a what if challenge. So I'm going to talk about how the electromagnetic spectrum is modeled today and what is the art of the possible. And then finally, going to become, what can you do? You can help become an ambassador for EMSO in the Department of Defense, and I'll explain more about what that means. Okay, the electromagnetic environment as a lexicon. First of all, what is a lexicon? Well, Merriam-Webster defines it as a language spoken by a group of people. So here's the challenge. There are now billions of people using the electromagnetic environment today, and we are not using the same language. What will be helpful is at least if the Department of Defense, and I don't mean each branch of service individually, I mean across the board, the Department of Defense begins to use terms like electromagnetic environment and electromagnetic spectrum as they are defined and using them as what they mean. there's a lot of confusion here because we're talking about very complex mathematical and technological concepts. So the words are getting used to make points and give briefings and get funding. But what isn't getting funded is what might be the most important piece of operating the electromagnetic environment for the Department of Defense. So maybe the decisions being made today are getting some things done, but maybe not all of the right things. So one of the first things that needs to happen is we do need a common language among all of us. And one of the purposes of this briefing is to perhaps inspire all of you to use words that we all agree to and use those words with conviction, that we need to develop a culture of awareness of what it means to operate in the electromagnetic environment. So now for what's changed. Prior to 1990, virtually no one ever knew the electromagnetic environment existed. And even though billions of people are using it today, they still don't know it exists. But let's talk about what happened. 60 years ago, the EME was used by perhaps 100,000 people across the globe, using one device per person. Now it is being used by over 6 billion people on the planet, and it is expected by 2030 to be used by over 7.5 billion people with an average of 10 devices. This means that the electromagnetic environment is becoming a social public good. If you don't know what a social public good is, I'll just hint to you, it's similar to things like global warming and industrial waste management, but I will talk more about it in just a few slides. But first, let's get on the same page about what exactly we're talking about. So when we say electromagnetic environment, we say it is all around us. It is not the electromagnetic spectrum, and it's not EMSO. It was there before the dawn of time, and it is a natural and now artificial, right? We're creating electromagnetic energy too now, of course. So it's a natural and artificial environment of radiating electromagnetic energy. If you'd like, it is the physical layer in which the Department of Defense wishes to have everything happen for EMSO, cyberspace, the information domain. Everything is 100%, nearly 100% dependent on electromagnetic spectrum. And so to the rest of the globe and to the outer atmosphere and the operational space, the electromagnetic environment means something different to each of these users. And that is where the beginning of the problem is. So, and one of the biggest problems is that the EME is invisible. It isn't sexy, it doesn't go boom, it doesn't make the nightly news, and forgive any impertinence, but it definitely doesn't get generals and admirals promoted today. So it is so sublime, nobody knows it exists, and yet everybody is using it. This is an extraordinary confluence of sociological, political, technological elements, and we've never had to deal with anything like this before. So what has changed now for the Department of Defense is the lexicon, the words we're using. So for example, we don't call it electronic warfare anymore, we call it electromagnetic warfare. But let's talk about what things we're doing back in the 60s in the Cold War. Back in the Cold War, electronic warfare faced a contested EME. And of course, electronic warfare is based on the 3 pillars: electronic attack, electronic protect, and electronic support. The linchpin here is the electronic protect, and that's what has changed, because now in the 1990s, the cellular network emerged and the internet traffic started getting transmitted. So now EP is not this exclusive mission area that the DoD needs to command and control. It is now something that is being shared with billions of users. And so now the lexicon has changed. Now we're not talking about operating circuit cards in devices that are not connected to any network. We're operating them autonomously. Now everything is connected. And we are also talking about billions of users using the same commodity space that the Department of Defense has been using for decades. So this is going to have an extraordinary impact. The electromagnetic environment has become a large-scale collective action problem. So what does that mean? There are 4 characteristics of a large-scale collective action problem. There's a large number of anonymous users who are spatially dispersed, right? The problem also has temporal displacement. In other words, decisions we make today will not manifest their consequences for years to come. And finally, LSCAPs are highly complex. As I mentioned earlier, other examples of LSCAPs are global warming and industrial waste management, and also clean water and fresh air. And that means every person on the planet is entitled to those things. And here's the thing about the 21st century electromagnetic environment that most people don't think about. Right now, the only people who are using the EME are those who are paying for it. However, what's coming soon is there will be a global social responsibility to provide the EME to everyone on the planet, whether they can pay for it or not. And this is why the EME needs to be declared as a large-scale collective action problem, because huge social responsibilities are coming. And this is why, basically because if someone is lying on the floor having a heart attack and doesn't have access to the spectrum, and they can't call for help, and the person dies, now there is a social consequence for not providing spectrum to that person. And another good example is if someone has a pacemaker, where the activity of the heart is being transmitted to a medical center. And if that spectrum is denied and the person is experiencing a heart failure and the corrective signal can't be sent back and the person dies, there are, in this country at least, legal ramifications for not providing the spectrum. So what does that mean for the Department of Defense? Well, it's tough because the DoD is used to operating with impunity and the EME, and now we have to take into consideration billions and billions of users. And what we can't continue to do is rest upon the way the electromagnetic spectrum has been modeled, and that is with, of course, ownership of frequencies to the telecoms. And I think most people on the phone probably remember the auctions and what a challenge that provided to the DoD. If you don't, I'll be talking about that in just a little bit. But basically, there are now much larger consequences for operating in the EME, and in particular, the electromagnetic spectrum. So let's talk about this for a minute. I don't mean to be impertinent again, but I just want to remind everyone the electromagnetic spectrum doesn't exist as a thing in the atmosphere. It is a tool and a measurement technique that we use to designate quantified and quantized electromagnetic energy into periodic units of measure called frequencies. So it's like a ruler in the atmosphere. And as we create and manipulate EM energy, we force it into specific periodic waves. And about 100 years ago, when the electromagnetic spectrum started getting used by more than just a few people, it got based on the Fourier transform model. And that means constant power periodic sinusoids. And that was a good model when only a few people were using it. But now we have requirements from the DoD in Joint Pub 385 to perform dynamic spectrum access and spectrum sharing. And I offer that this model for the electromagnetic spectrum will not hold up to the demand signal that's coming from 7.5 billion people. The ownership of frequency bands will just not cut it if the EME is truly now a social public good. So before going into what is the art of the possible for modeling the electromagnetic spectrum going forward, let's talk about a couple of terms that get used in the Department of Defense now to address some of this subject area. The first is electromagnetic spectrum operations. So we already talked about the transition from electronic warfare, which was electronics in the field that weren't connected, wielding some radar signal for a brief moment in time and then going away. Now every device is connected, so we call it electromagnetic warfare. And JP 385 defines EMSO as the mathematical representation of electromagnetic warfare and something called spectrum management. For those Army guys on the phone, guys and gals, the Army instituted spectrum management after the situation in Operation Enduring Freedom, where counter radio controlled IED devices, commonly known as CREW, were deployed without consideration for what it meant to operate in the spectrum. And our war fighters used it in such a way that caused contestation in the spectrum. And I think most of us know what happened with that, but suffice it to say, we needed a deep education on managing frequencies and the use of the spectrum once we started deploying CREW devices. So spectrum management is essentially the art and science of who owns what frequencies and when you can emit and how you can operate in it. And so that is spectrum management. And so now, if you take the term electromagnetic warfare, which was classically EA plus EP plus ES, and you break it down into EMSO, EMSO is now EA plus EP plus ES plus spectrum management. The linchpin here is electromagnetic protect. Up until the 1990s, EP could be exercised in theater virtually with impunity. I mean, we could just go there and start emitting. We took measures to ensure our access to the spectrum in theater, primarily jamming or MCON, emissions control, or some covert deception by scrambling communications or predetermining what frequencies we were going to communicate at, or also having very sophisticated and autonomous hopping mechanisms. So the tools we used then will not work now because of the reasons I just explained. Billions and billions of users using the EMS. So the weak point is now electromagnetic protect. EP used to be only dependent on a very small group who are wielding some electronic warfare mission, usually electronic attack, but now it's going to affect a far larger group of people. And to bring this point home, if we were to show up in theater today with the intent to jam the environment, it is likely the locals will pick up arms against us because we'd be jamming their communications and their internet. And we have never been faced with this situation before, but it's something very real that we need to take into account. So I think I'll pause here, Brian, and make sure everyone is still connected and I can keep pressing on. Are we good?
All good. I haven't seen anything from the chat. Looks like everyone's got what they need to. At least one question has come in, so it's a good pause point to remind everyone about the Q&A portion of the WebEx platform. So hopefully everyone can find that distinct from the chat where they can enter their questions that we'll get to at the end. So otherwise, continue on. All good, Melinda.
Roger. Continuing on. Thank you so much. So let's talk a little bit about the nexus of cyberspace and EMSO. So I think it's indisputable. Cyberspace is a maneuver space where we wield military operations as part of the information domain. And EMSO is also a maneuver space, but we are conducting EW operations in the electromagnetic spectrum. And so here's the challenge. Both of these maneuver spaces have the EMS in common. And if you want to get quite literal, the EMS is the transport layer for cyber data. So this means that cyber data cannot be transmitted without access to the electromagnetic spectrum, unless it remains hardwired. But I think all of us recognize now that that is not an option anymore. At some point, the data ends up in free space. So this means the EMS is fundamental to both operational maneuver spaces. But it also means that both maneuver spaces are 100% dependent on efforts to conduct electromagnetic protect. And I'm pretty sure the cyberspace community doesn't like to think about calling it that, But if the Department of Defense is going to take measures to assure access to the spectrum for EMSO, they're going to need to take the same measures for cyberspace. We cannot make these plans in swim lanes and in silos. We have to come together and make these plans together and collaborate on solutions. And that starts, of course, with a common lexicon, and then it moves out with collaborative plans. So this is a fundamental paradox occurring in the DoD right now, that we're making plans for cyber missions and we're making plans for EMSO and EW, but those plans are not the same when it comes to assuring access to the spectrum. Language really will start to matter, and especially to start getting access to the spectrum funded appropriately. All right. We're going to need a cooperative plan if we are going to institute EMBM, electromagnetic battle management, JADC2, and multi-domain operations. This means that cyber and EMSO are going to have to cooperate in the same electromagnetic space, and those plans will need to reflect that common operation. So let's do a little thought exercise. In fact, let me just make one comment here. We really won't be able to wield any of our strategic plans unless we mutually collaborate on EP and decide collectively how we're going to assure access to the spectrum. And so policy needs to change, doctrine needs to change, and technique needs to change. So what if? Let's do a little thought experiment. As I mentioned earlier, so this tool doesn't let me make the bullets. Okay. I'm not going to show my next slide yet. What if what I mentioned earlier, that the electromagnetic spectrum is a tool that we created by modeling the spectrum according to constant power periodic sinusoids through the Fourier transform? Why do you suppose the Fourier transform became the model for the spectrum? I don't think a lot of people have given a lot of thought to this, so I'm going to share with you likely the reasons. The first is, in 1811, Fourier developed the mathematical theorem for Fourier transform, and therefore it was very easily promulgated across the globe because mathematical principles were universally known. So it was very easy to get a batch of letters sent out. It might have taken months, but at least the message got across the world using fundamental mathematical principles. The second reason is the time domain. It requires multiplication in the time domain, but in the frequency domain, for those engineers out there, convolution is much easier, isn't it? I know that. The third reason is when linear computing came up in the 1950s, it was far easier to code the Fourier transform because it's just an integral. It's just an infinite sum. It can be bounded or infinite. So once computers started to emerge, it became very easy to code these stepwise functions of the Fourier transform. And the fourth reason is the Fourier transform makes the sinusoids constant power and periodic. So they are very easy to model and estimate without doing a lot of computation. Okay, we already, in fact, that's what this graph shows, is that you already know what a series of bits will look like in the Fourier domain. So that didn't need to be collaborated on. But I submit that with improvements to processing power and newly sophisticated algorithms that are based on artificial intelligence and machine learning, a disruptive opportunity has emerged. Here's an idea. Let's model signals of interest with polynomials. Okay, so for those of you who haven't even heard this word since high school, you remember polynomials, right? Cubics, quadratics. But the important thing is, look at these waveforms. They get to infinity pretty quickly in time, And they are aperiodic, and they take up far less time and space, if you will, okay? So if we were to model the spectrum with polynomials, what would that look like? Well, instead of a bunch of periodic sinusoidal waves that are subject to interference, we could have many more waveforms that are based on polynomials. So you remember your wave interference techniques, right? When they're happy, they are A plus B, and when they're not. And so this is primarily how the EMS has been modeled, is with slicing up the spectrum, selling off chunks of frequencies to different owners, and don't touch my spectrum. Excuse me, let me take a drink. Don't touch my spectrum now. But I submit that we have a much greater opportunity here to really utilize the spectrum with far more efficiency. And what capabilities might we get from modeling the spectrum with polynomials? First of all, low power. And what I mean by this is you can reach further distances with the same power, or you need far less power to transmit the distances you intend to use today. You also have much increased capacity, possibly as much as 10 to the 6th or 10 to the 9th signals, but those limits are currently being tested. But it definitely uses available energy in the spectrum far more efficiently, because it doesn't tie up the electrons and molecules and air molecules in the energy forms that's not needed. It's far more direct and it's quicker. And there's also a added feature of higher security without added complexity, either in programming or in computing power. So this is an extraordinary opportunity for LPI, LPD. Low probability of intercept, low probability of detect. So the military has an extraordinary benefit in modeling the spectrum differently with security. And it also, the adversary is not expecting this, and also traditional spectrum analyzers would simply see these polynomial waveforms as noise or as nothing at all. So what would this mean? Well, a huge disruption, not only to technology, but also to the political and commercial and industrial framework of the spectrum. There would be no more ownership of frequencies. And I can talk about this for an entire hour, but let me just say that the Institute did a report a few years ago on the impact of selling off the frequencies, large chunks of frequencies to the telecoms, 4 big auctions, if you remember. And the burden this placed on the Department of Defense, and how difficult it made it for them to operate in CONUS at the test ranges. And the report proposed that we do things like, I can't think of it right now, but the important thing is that it really placed a burden technologically and financially on the Department of Defense on how to operate, and they have far less capacity of spectrum to do that with. So if they were to think about modeling the spectrum differently, then I'm just saying we might alleviate some of our problems. Yes, we'd have to go back to the drawing board, but maybe not so much. It might just be software-defined radio, the change of a card. I don't know, but this is the art of the possible that I'm proposing today. So the challenge is the entire spectrum today is based on a stationary Fourier transform, constant power, periodic sinusoidal model, but remodeling it with non-stationary waveforms could be the disruptive change that is needed. And if you think that this isn't possible, look at what just happened. In the last 4 months, 2 teenagers changed 2,000 years worth of mathematics by defining the Pythagorean theorem without using trigonometry. So I submit that this can be done. And I'm just using this opportunity to invite you to really think differently about what it's going to mean to operate in the spectrum in the 21st century, and how we really might need to consider changing one of our most fundamental assumptions, the Fourier transform model of the spectrum. So what can you do? I invite all of you to consider is that if you work in this space, are you working on cyberspace, EMSO, EMBM? Ask your colleagues, what are we doing to assure our access to the EMS? And have we conferred on that plan with others? And where do we intend to operate? And how will that affect the locals? So far more questions need to be asked to enable Electromagnetic Protect. And you can become an ambassador and just start asking the questions and see what the answers are. Okay. And then promote collaborative discussion and question policy. And finally, be assured that your work probably involves a spectrum dependent system. And so that means you're going to need access to the EMS. And make sure you understand what's being done in your realm of concern to assure that access to the EMS. And what needs to happen now? Well, please start using the Lexicon. The electromagnetic environment is the natural and artificial radiation of electromagnetic energy. And the electromagnetic spectrum is this ruler in the atmosphere that we use to measure frequencies and define frequencies. It's the technological base at the moment. We have EMSO, which is the combination of electromagnetic warfare and spectrum management. And then we have the EMBM, JADC2, and just try to use those terms as they are meant to be and what they mean. This does mean that we need to start thinking about EW more as systems of systems, because now everything is connected. It's not the way it used to be. Secondarily, electromagnetic protect capabilities need to be made a top priority. Traditionally, EP capability gets kicked to the curb as soon as a project or a program starts to overrun its cost or schedule. So let's make sure that now this capability is getting funded. I think Dave Tremper just got promoted and now is in charge of JADC2. And part of the reason for their having created a new position for him is because he needs to create this capability across the board to enable JADC2. And finally, the DoD EMSO community needs ideas for dynamic spectrum access and spectrum sharing. And that might mean something as remarkably disruptive as leaving the Fourier transform model for the spectrum and moving to a non-constant aperiodic sinusoidal waveform. It doesn't need to be polynomials, but it needs to be something else potentially that has far less chance of interfering. And that way we'll have far more dynamism in the spectrum. And we'll be able to operate with more impunity and also to accommodate the 7.5 billion users that are coming. So the plans that we make today, remember, temporal displacement, the decisions we make today won't be known for years to come. But we need to start making better decisions today, and all of you can help with that. So with that, I want to thank you. First, I want to introduce you to some people with the RVJ Institute, my husband and co-founder of the Institute and Dean, Steve Tarango, call sign Tango, maybe you know him, and also our chairman of the Board of Advisors, retired Commander, Navy Commander R. Scott Oliver, call sign Sherm, and he was instrumental in helping with the content for this presentation. And I just want to thank you so very much. And with that, that concludes the formal part of my presentation, and we can look at some questions.
Yeah, it's very good. Thank you, Melinda, so much. That was a very good presentation. There's some good chatter that was going on in the chat, which was good between participants. So I'm always glad to see that. And some folks were able to find the Q&A section. For those who weren't able to find that yet, there's a couple of ellipses in the bottom part of the screen within the WebEx platform. You can click that to find the Q&A. So we do have quite a few in the queue, and I will just kind of read them out loud to you and let you respond to them. If you, Melinda, are able to find the Q&A, you can kind of read along as well in advance. But the first one that came in was just asking, when you attack the EMS, are you attacking cyberspace as well?
In my opinion, absolutely. Because if you deny access to the spectrum, how can you possibly transmit?
Yeah. Well, quick and easy. It's good.
By the way, can I just ask, so Tango's in Denmark right now, but he was going to try to make it. Tango, are you on the line? Is the audience allowed to speak, Brian?
You know what? Let me see. It's on a case-by-case basis. The system mutes everyone by default, so I can unmute Tango if he wants to chime
I don't
in.
know if he's here, but he definitely should field some of these questions.
Sure.
So
Yep.
let's just take
requested
30
him to
seconds
unmute.
to see if he's on the line.
Yep. I just requested to unmute him, so we'll see if we can get him in queue here.
Oh, so you see him in the audience?
Yes, and
Great. Okay.
should be unmuted now. So Tango, you're in here with us?
I'm online.
All right, great. All right. So the next question that we had here was, and it's littered with acronyms, so bear with me, but it says, what's, in your opinions here, what is the best of breed simulation for blue air EMSO against red SAM/EW radar that could be leveraged to talk to real hardware or real radar? And then there's a list of a couple to pick from here.
That was
go ahead. No, go ahead. There's probably 6 of them listed. So before I rattle them off, you can maybe comment on that question.
So that was the technique I was trying to think of. Obviously, I have presentation nerves. Tango, when we wrote the report, we were proposing that we do what at the training ranges? Because of an L?
Oh, well, there's live virtual constructive.
Yes.
Is the basic construct that encompasses all of this. The slate activity has gotten quite a bit of made some headway, specifically within the Navy that I'm familiar with. JSE is the upcoming activities that are going to be based, Air Force based out of Edwards and some other locations. I personally think the JSE is probably going to be the next big deal to move hardware and simulations. But AFSIM is currently the program of record that is tying a number of pieces to it. So I'm not familiar with ICAD's Odessa or Nova, but again, I'm primarily an Air Force background. So those are the pieces I'm familiar with.
No, that's good. I appreciate that. That answers the question at least.
Hopefully.
Let's see. Next question's just kind of asking about the polynomial waveforms that you spoke about, and the request there is simply that you share a link or some source for what you had noted as selling off the spectrum. Is that available to be shared out?
A note about selling off this. I don't think the two are related.
Okay.
Maybe I don't understand the question, Brian.
Yeah, I was under the presumption that this is something that was mentioned in the slides, that maybe I just didn't recall, that you referenced selling off the spectrum, but perhaps it's something different.
Oh, well, I can speak to the auctions that have taken place over the last 7 years or so, where the telecoms approached Congress and said, we want more spectrum. And Congress said, oh, well, if we sell them all this spectrum, we'll get billions of dollars. And so they did. Yes, there are links out there for the details around those auctions. It would take me some time to find them though, so I wouldn't be able to do that, but perhaps, Brian, if there's a way for me to get them to you, to get them to this person who's asking.
Sure.
But that's public knowledge. All of the frequencies that were sold off and for how much money. One of them was $87 billion. Wow. So I can't honestly blame Congress for doing it, but they did. I don't believe they understood the impact to the department and its ability to operate it, CONUS especially, and train like we'll fight. So, so that answer the question?
I think it does.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with the polynomials. That's an entirely new scientific and modeling approach. So
Right.
yeah, we'll keep those separate.
Well, and kind of off that topic, there was a question that was kind of sort of submitted really in the chat, but I'll ask it here because it's related. And it was, in your opinion, how do you take the economics out of the spectrum, given that the ITU and FCC are both in it for profit?
Oh, amen. You nailed it.
And there's no easy answer, maybe, but.
Well, okay, so I'm so glad you asked, because now that I get to plug the Institute. So we need a neutral third party to bring all the stakeholders into a room and have discussions about what the right course of action is, because there is such an addiction right now and a demand for to be able to wield commercially economical and industrial results from utilizing the spectrum. And I'm not saying this is going to be easy, but it needs to be done, because there eventually, like I said, there's going to be a social responsibility to provide the spectrum to people who can't pay for it. And so, and I don't know what those answers are, but I do know that we have dealt with issues like this in the past when companies 120 years ago were dumping industrial waste into the rivers, and it was polluting the waters. And of course, people were dying. Our government came together with other world governments where it needed to clean up the situation. So we've done it before, and we're going to have to do it again. And it's a great question, because it basically is at the heart of why we stood up the Institute, because we are really hoping one day that conversation will start to happen.
Well, good. Now I'm very glad that I asked that question.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. The next question, it looks like in queue from our Q&A was, I'm not exactly sure what it was referring to, but it just said, how would this affect the hardware and antenna designs that are often tuned to frequency bands? So maybe you could speak more generally about how hardware and antenna designs are tuned to frequency bands, and maybe how that plays into the EMSO kind of world.
Sure, I'd be glad to address that. But before I do, Tango, would you have anything to say on this topic, or should I go ahead?
Well, the beauty of the polynomial concept, the non-stationary spectrum, means that you can work over any frequency range. It's just the power and the waveform design. So part of what this is pointing to, though, is multifunction capabilities. So apertures, ideally, you will want to make your apertures such that you can work across broader spectrum bands. But it doesn't tie you to a specific frequency. And the beauty of the software-defined radios now is it allows you to move across frequencies. So the aperture, the physics of the apertures generally are the limitations, but as we delve into more arrays, that gives us more opportunities to handle broader frequency ranges.
Tango, you broke up there. Please repeat that last sentence.
As we move to arrays, whether they're airborne or otherwise, it gives us the opportunity to change different frequency bands without having to necessarily change your apertures.
Okay, and I was just going to add that this technology is in its infant stages, but does need to be. I see it being just a circuit card being changed out. I don't know. Maybe I'm not privy to the details and of where we are with it right now, but I think it could be something like that. But I will say this, that we'll need a different spectrum analyzer, first of all. And second of all, there will be a change to protocol. What we decide on ahead of time and what the receiver and the transmitter are going to be collaborating on, that will need to change too. Does that answer the question?
I sure hope so. Unfortunately, we can't unmute the individual questioners, so we'll have to hope that is, and if not, we can get a comment back in the chat.
Maybe you can, yeah. Okay, great.
So the next question, again, I'm not sure exactly what it's referring to, but it says, does this technology have any prototypes? It says, since polynomials will eventually go off into infinity, does that imply infinite amplitude? And how is the information encoded on these polynomials?
The answer to that question goes beyond my understanding. However, let's see. Brian, where is that question?
Yeah, it's in the Q&A, maybe actually almost dead middle of the whole long
Okay.
list.
Can you read it to me again?
Sure. It says, so how does this does this technology have any prototypes? It says, since
Okay.
polynomials will eventually go off into infinity, does that imply infinite amplitude? How is the information encoded on these polynomials?
Yeah, it does have a couple of prototypes and goes off into, and then there is a special way to code it. They call it symbol waveform hopping, and it has to do with putting hundreds of alphabets out there, but the only one that matters is the one that the transmitter and the receiver know about.
Mhm.
As to the infinite amplitude, I cannot comment on that. I'm not privy to those technical details.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay.
And the question was just asked kind of related to that in the chat. It says, now how would we know if adversaries were already using the polynomial technique?
Oh, that's brilliant. Right, exactly. So, yeah, I have mixed feelings about the fact that there are patents out there on this, because that means they know, the adversary knows about it. We don't know.
Right.
But we do know this, that if they are, and they had a spectrum analyzer out there that could read polynomial energy, it wouldn't be able to read our polynomial energy because they wouldn't know what polynomials we were operating at.
Good point.
Okay. Great.
The next question was about directed energy. How directed energy, or where does directed energy, like lasers and radio frequency, how does that play into EP and EMSO?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Tango, you got some there?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. The high power microwave laser type activities, whether for low power use for communications or high power use for active destructive capabilities, are a form of EMSO. It is use of the energy within the spectrum. It's just focused energy within the spectrum. So they play a piece in, I would say, electronic attack for the most part, offensive type. But there is a piece of, I would say, when you start looking at some of the capabilities that directed energy give, they provide an EP function in some cases. So, and then protecting sensors from lasers and other things are a form of EP as well. So.
Great. No, that's good. Melinda, any more to add to that?
Nope, that's
All right.
that's great.
Good.
I mean, yeah. Well, directed energy, EP directed energy wise can be destructive. So, you know, you can't just burn out everything. So you just got to be careful with that, because you want to maintain your own capabilities, right?
Sure.
Right. Okay.
Well, then let's see, what do we get next? General question from how can the open source digital radio community help here?
What a
Open
wonderful
source digital radio
question. Well, they were the pioneers, if you will, right? They came together collaboratively and demonstrated collective, non-economical intention to use the spectrum. They would be extraordinary ambassadors to sit down at the table and share what it means to share the spectrum in new ways. But wow, I've never been asked that question before. But you're making me think I should have a ham radio operator on my board. That's a great idea. Yeah, reach out to me. Whoever asked that question, please reach out to us, and I'll see what I can do to get you a better answer. That's great.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to the next kind of question I would ask as we kind of close out our time here, which is how can someone engage with the RVJ Institute as a partner? And then while you're speaking to that, another question that was asked is how you're all differentiated from AOC. So maybe you could kind of speak to engaging with RVJ as an institute and what makes you all different than AOC.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. First, we have a website, and on the website is an opportunity to ask our experts questions. And then the Institute is a center of excellence and a knowledge management hub. And eventually, I hope it will be the vehicle to hold those very challenging conversations with disparate stakeholders that have very different intentions and plans for the spectrum. That is a very different mission area than the Association of Old Crows, which definitely has advocacy on Capitol Hill, but is primarily geared towards business to business opportunity in the electromagnetic spectrum, and making sure that our industry partners get incredible opportunities to collaborate at shows and at local symposiums for each of the chapters. So our mission areas are different but complementary. Is that a good answer? Does that explain it?
I think so, yeah.
Great.
And so for our final moment here, let me just say thank you to everybody. We're gonna close out and respect our time. The slides are available, as I mentioned in the beginning, on the webinar's website at DSIAC.org. If there's any follow-on questions, I know there's quite a few we weren't able to get to with time, but if there's any follow-up questions, you're welcome to reach out to Melinda or Steve or R. Scott Oliver at the email addresses you can see there. You're also welcome to submit a technical inquiry to DSIAC.org. RVJ is part of the DSIAC team, so we're happy to help field some questions that way as well. And then again, the webinar presentation has been recorded, so we'll make that available as well. So if you have anything in the meantime, we'll be happy to help you out, but I appreciate everyone's time, and especially Melinda, Steve, and everyone else for being here. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
All right, have a great day.
Have a great day.